Hello, and welcome on this MA course East meets West, Connections and Convergencies in Cold War and Post-Cold War Europe. My name is Martelt Venke. I'm a professor of contemporary transnational history at the Center for Contemporary and Digital History of the University of Luxembourg. And our guest lecturer today is Dr. Hanno Hoogmoed, who will give a guest lecture titled Entangled Entertainment, Cinema and Television in Cold War Berlin. East and West Berlin were entangled in a multiple of ways. Despite competing systems, there were numerous connections both before and after the erection of the Berlin Wall between the two halves of this divided city. Modern entertainment culture was a very important one. It was a driving force of entanglement processes as it overcame in equal measure social and spatial boundaries. This is a key reason why popular entertainment was frequently politicized, despite its being rooted in the simple need for entertainment. This goes especially for the post-war period marked by system confrontation, in which audiovisual media in particular offered cross-border entertainment and therefore became the object of heated political conflicts. The entanglement and politicization of modern entertainment culture are particularly manifest in East and West Berlin, as will be shown in this lecture with respect to the Berlin neighbourhoods of Friedrichshain in the east and Kreuzberg in the west, by focusing on cinema and television in Cold War Berlin. Hanno Hoogmoed is Executive Manager and Research Fellow at the Leibniz Zentrum für Zeithistorische Forschung, the Center for Contemporary History in Potsdam in Germany. In 2016, he gained his PhD at the Free University Berlin. He studied history, theater studies, and communications at the Free University Berlin, Humboldt University Berlin, and at the University of Minnesota. From 2005 until 2011, he was Research Fellow at the Free University Berlin, where he planned and managed Germany's first public history master's program. In 2021, he was a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Contemporary and Digital History in Luxembourg. His research focuses on urban and public history.
My name is Hanno Hoogmoed, and I would like to talk about entangled entertainment, cinema and television in Cold War Berlin. East and West Berlin were entangled in a multitude of ways. Despite competing systems, there were numerous connections both before and after the erection of the wall between the two halves of this divided city. Modern entertainment culture was a very important one. It was a driving force for entanglement processes as it overcame in equal measure social and spatial boundaries. This is the key reason why popular entertainment was frequently politicized, despite its being rooted in the simple need for entertainment. This goes especially for the post-war period marked by the system confrontation, in which audiovisual media in particular offered cross-media entertainment and therefore became the object of heated political conflicts. Political and educational elites in both East and West initially reacted with the same resentment towards the newfangled entertainment enjoyed by post-war youth, condemning it as trash and filth, merely because it didn't conform with traditional educated middle-class notions of high culture and serious entertainment. In the GDR, Western-oriented juvenile entertainment was branded as an ideological diversion of the class enemy, ideologische Diversion des Klassenfeindes, and was hence doubly stigmatized. The entanglement and politicization of modern entertainment culture are particularly manifest in East and West Berlin, as will be shown in the following with respect to the Berlin neighborhoods of Friedrichshain in the east and Kreuzberg in West Berlin. These two districts shared a common border on the fault line of the Cold War, and I would like to show this to you by using this map, and you can see when you have a look at this map that these two districts were pretty much in the city center of this divided Berlin. Friedrichshain in East Berlin belonging to the Soviet sector, and Kreuzberg in West Berlin belonging to the American sector. In my lecture, I will first show how before 1961 East Germans flocked to cinemas close to the border in Kreuzberg. Second, I will show, using interviews with contemporary witnesses in Friedrichshain, how the practice of going to nearby Western cinemas was replaced in East Berlin with the widespread consumption of Western television after the construction of the wall. Third, I will show that modern media entertainment in the divided urban community of Berlin was particularly explosive, conflating as it did the ideological boundaries of the Cold War with traditional fears about the unbridled and bridled amusement of urban working-class youth. Cultural criticism and the Cold War often went hand in hand here, hard as this may be to be imagined nowadays in the new party capital of Berlin. So I come to my first part, the Kreuzberg border cinemas. Kreuzberg, like other West Berlin districts, had a total of 10 so-called border cinemas, Grenzkinos, prior to 1961. And there's another map that I would like to show you. And you can see, if we have a look at this map that shows basically just the eastern part of the district of Kreuzberg, that was very close to the river Spree, that a number of 10 border cinemas, Grenzkinos, was there immediately right next to the border, very easy to access for East Berliners traveling or commuting to West Berlin prior to 1961, when it was still possible. So these border cinemas, these Grenzkinos, were located close to the sector border and mainly targeted visitors from East Berlin and elsewhere in the GDR. The real draw of border cinemas was the wide array of popular American entertainment films they offered at reduced prices. East Berlin cinemas could not compete in this regard. Most were in poor condition with superannuated projection equipment dating largely from the pre-war period. The East, moreover, did not produce enough feature films and not enough circulating copies of these ones it did to meet the city's considerable demand for entertainment. More importantly, however, what was that most of the films running in East Berlin movie theaters had a distinctly didactic tone. A large proportion of contemporary East German films was set in the world of socialist manufacturing, precisely what the majority of moviegoers were trying to escape from during their hours off. It is therefore no surprise that many of them chose to go to Western cinemas instead, which promised a temporary respite from the harsh realities of daily life under the communist regime. For the operators of these West Berlin cinemas, the steady stream of East German moviegoers was a huge source of income. Though they only paid 50 pfennigs per show upon presenting an East German ID, and often a mere 25 pfennigs for matinee screenings, less half of the regular price, they nonetheless filled up the cinemas, even in the late 1950s, when in many places the rise of television was leading to cinema extinction, Kinosterben. Moreover, at the behest of the American occupying forces, border cinemas were exempt from paying the usual entertainment tax to the Berlin Senate. This gave the operators of these cinemas a considerable competitive advantage over the movie theaters in the Western hinterland. The successful West Berlin model met with harsh criticism in the eastern half of the city. The daily mental border crossing, geistige Grenzgängerschaft, of the population of East Berlin and its interest in American production were a political thorn in the side of the SED. The films being shown at these cinemas did not conform with the notions of good entertainment that the GDR had inherited from the Weimar Republic and its working class culture. Non-purposeful pastimes that did not promote the education and the edification of the public were not part of the concept of entertainment espoused by the communist regime well into the 1970s. This turned out in the long term to be a big disadvantage for the East in the competition between a socialist and a capitalist model of Germany, a battle also being waged in the domain of popular media. The West was eminently more attractive, not least in terms of its entertainment offerings. But even in West Berlin, critics lamented the popular westerns and gangster movies being screened in the border cinemas. These hostile reactions were a culture-critical statement rooted in the paternalist trash and filth, Schmutz und Schund, campaigns that began at the turn of the 20th century. Even in the 1950s, this sense of resentment was still widespread, often coupled with a deep-seated anti-Americanism among parts of the social elite. The West Berlin Senate fought a vicious battle with private cinema operators about the quality of movies being shown at border cinemas. The issue was mainly sexual licentiousness and graphic depictions of violence. The debate culminated in the so-called All-Berlin Cultural Plan, Gesamtberliner Kulturplan of 1958, explicitly taking into account moviegoers from the East. Only quality films, so-called Prädikatsfilme, which were given the rating valuable or especially valuable by the Film Evaluation Office in Wiesbaden, were eligible for state subsidies. This was in no way detrimental to or oppositive to the appeal of West Berlin border cinemas, however. East Berliners were allowed to purchase their admission tickets using Eastern currency at a set exchange of 1-to-1, and the number of East German moviegoers in West Berlin cinema border cinemas actually increased to 600,000 a month. The SED, the Communist Party in the DDR, was suspicious of this stream of viewers and kept close tabs on them. Indeed, East Berlin functionaries were often among the best authorities on what was playing in West Berlin. Despite this sense of mistrust, there were occasional attempts to learn from the enemy, allowing the East to gain some ground. Thus, for example, in 1956, during the brief political thaw, Tauwetter, in the GDR, East Berlin cinemas temporarily increased their popularity by pandering to public taste and importing Western movies, though not American ones. Border cinemas were set up in the East, attempting to lure Western visitors by offering popular Western movies at lower prices in the East. But even with reduced fees for the unemployed, these movie theaters failed to live to expectations, and in the end, the cinema war was clearly decided in favor of the West. It was only the erection of the Berlin Wall in 1961 that succeeded in keeping East German moviegoers out of West Berlin cinemas for good. With that, the economic basis of border cinemas vanished overnight, forcing 5 of the 10 Kreuzberg border cinemas to close by the end of 1961, that is only 4 months after the erection of the Berlin Wall. My colleague, the historian Michael Lemke, talks about an entangled society, Verflechtungsgesellschaft, in characterizing divided Berlin before the construction of the wall. Notwithstanding the intense politicization and in both halves of the city during the height of the Cold War, the societies of East and West Berlin remained closely intertwined prior to 1961. This was particularly true in day-to-day life. The inhabitants of this divided city crossed borders to shop for food, to go to school, and to earn their living, but especially for entertainment, which included going to the cinema. The entertainment offerings of this entangled media public sphere were appropriated in a private manner by consumers who followed their personal entertainment preferences and flocked to the Magnificent Seven or to Ben-Hur. Thus, the Kreuzberg border cinemas not only linked East and West, but also the public and the private sphere. I come to my second part, to Western television in East Berlin. With the construction of the wall in 1961, electronic media overtook the role that border cinemas once occupied, becoming the most important link between East and West. This included Western radio programs, which were available on the airwaves throughout most of the GDR and had a formative influence on developments in the East. The popular broadcaster radio in the American sector, RIAS, for instance, played a crucial role in the national uprising of June 17, 1953. The SED, the Communist Party, therefore sought to prevent its people from listening to the RIAS program by disturbing its frequencies. The jamming of radio signals, however, only affected medium and long wave, but not very high frequencies, UKW, FM, that were most commonly used in Berlin. By the 1960s and 70s, the number of jamming signals decreased. The SED did no longer invest in jamming radio techniques. Western television shows too were an important bridge between East and West. And I'd like to show you another picture that clearly shows how important it was. Because with the exception of the so-called Valley of the Clueless, das Tal der Ahnungslosen, in the region of Dresden in the southeast of Germany and a few areas in the remote northeast corner of the GDR, most East Germans, about 80%, were able to tune into the two main West German national broadcasters, ARD and ZDF, in the 1970s and 80s. Western television became all the more important once it became a mass media. In the course of the 1960s, the majority of households in the GDR gained access to a TV set. Most could pick up Western channels which subsequently took on the role of a surrogate public sphere in the GDR, an Ersatzöffentlichkeit, as we say in German. East Berlin had almost ideal conditions for receiving radio and television programs due to its close proximity to West Berlin broadcasting stations. And if we have a look at the map, you can see in the middle of the GDR there was, of course, East Berlin, but also West Berlin, and in West Berlin there were all these signal stations, the television tower. I'm not talking about the famous television tower of East Berlin, but there was also another television tower on the Schäferberg in West Berlin, and from there they were sending the TV signal all over the GDR. So that meant that in East Berlin, which was so close to West Berlin, there was perfect television signal. And I switch to another scene without the map. And yet, there was nothing free and easy about tuning into Western stations, the act itself being highly politicized, as it undermined the SED's media and information monopoly. Listening or watching Western media was denounced by the SED as ideological diversion of the class enemy. The culmination of this ideological struggle against West German media was the so-called lightning contra NATO stations, which was a campaign in the fall of 1961 when the SED, having sealed the border, now cracked down on mental border crossers, on geistige Grenzgänger. Thousands of members of the Free German Youth, the FDJ, were sent up onto rooftops across the GDR to check which way the antennas were facing and to correct them if necessary. The tenement blocks of the eastern district of Friedrichshain, built in quadrangular fashion, made this task even easier, allowing eager FDJ members to literally jump from roof to roof. What they failed to take into account, however, were the antennas some occupants had secretly installed under the roofs in the attics of their buildings and hence out of public view. Another strategy for disguising the consumption of Western media was restricting communication about it to a wholly private context. The distinction between public and private in the GDR was something people learned early on. School children were careful about what they said in the public about the TV programs they watched at home. And in no circumstances were their teachers allowed to find out that they and their families were familiar with Western TV. Thus, many parents impressed upon their children from a very young age that it was better to keep quiet in public about their evening viewing habits, because even a candid answer to seemingly harmless questions like what the Little Sandman's character looked like in East Berlin bedtime show or the trademark East German clock ident could serve as an indication to teachers which TV stations they watched at home and hence get parents or pupils into trouble. As the chief agency of education in the GDR, the school system jealously guarded the SED's information monopoly. One of its major tasks was to educate the so-called new socialist individual, who was supposed to be free of all capitalist influences. But given the existence of a dual television landscape, this was an all but hopeless endeavor, leading to countless conflicts between teachers and pupils. The consumption of Western television in the GDR can best be reconstructed by analyzing these conflicts. This task presents two primary difficulties, however. On the one hand, TV reception is fleeting by nature and hard to trace historically. Contemporary audience research on television in the GDR would only permit drawing indirect conclusions about East Germans' consumption of Western programming. On the other hand, the fact that these audiovisual media were oriented towards a national audience and broadcast nationwide makes it hard to reach any specific conclusions about the local consumption of Western television in the capital of the GDR, in East Berlin only. Media historical interviews, however, are one way to retrospectively reconstruct historical media behaviors. 7 interviews with former East German teachers at Polytechnic High Schools, so-called POS, Politische Oberschulen, in Friedrichshain and Prenzlauer Berg, both East Berlin districts, will serve as a basis for the following investigation of Western television and its politicization in East Berlin. Granted, these interviews are not a representative or objective reflection of past reality, but a merely individual and limited approach to the topic. It was evident that the interviewees constructed their biographies as the interview progressed and were not immune to interpretive patterns acquired since the events transpired since the last 30 years. A critical interpretation of these interviews with former teachers has to take into account the radical break in social relationships, their personal, professional, and material development, changes in the school system, as well as the transformation of the media landscape since 1989. The teachers interviewed often didn't have time to watch television because of the heavy workload. Added to this was the systematic convergence of curricular and extracurricular activities in the GDR. As propagandists of the state, teachers had to organize flag ceremonies or communist youth group activities, such as afternoon pioneer meetings and a mandatory year-long civics class for FDJ members of the Free German Youth. They had to maintain contact with factory or farm brigades, sponsoring children's groups, do military recruiting, and much, much more. They were highly public individuals and had considerably less free time than their fellow citizens. Furthermore, television, in particular entertainment shows, contradicted in many respects the values and social prestige of the educated middle classes that many teachers in the GDR were trying to convey, despite the fact that they themselves rarely came from this social background. Thus, despite the wholesale replacement of educators and cultural elites in the GDR since the 1950s, conventional paradigms of the teaching profession had largely remained intact. This included the widely shared conviction among teachers that reading a good book, was always preferable to watching television. It is thus all the more remarkable that the majority of teachers surveyed indicated that they did in fact watch television on a regular basis. And almost all of them, sooner or later, had some experience with Western programming. Some came from functionary families that tended to toe the party line and refused to turn into ARD or ZDF for ideological reasons, or from regions where they couldn't get Western stations like the so-called Valley of the Clueless in the region of Dresden, southeast of the GDR. And yet, most of them began to watch both East and West German programming at the latest when they started their own families and began their careers. Western television, however, was more present in East Berlin than it was in other parts of the country. One of the teachers interviewed, who had come to Friedrichshain to work at the Politische Oberschule, at the POS, after teaching training in Neubrandenburg, experienced a kind of culture shock in East Berlin. And I quote, "I'd sometimes meet up with colleagues from work. I was in Berlin now. And they'd say, 'Have you seen this before?' Something completely idiotic to me nowadays. Dallas. At 9:30, the whole street echoed with the theme song. And, well, you'd end up watching it too and actually thought it was pretty cool. It was a totally different world. Just seeing the whole Western lifestyle and how the people there dressed, all fancy schmancy, and then all the thrilling intrigues. It definitely had something. I think that was my introduction to Western television. End of quote. This statement bespeaks the ubiquity of and allure of Western television. It was just everywhere. And the statement also shows that it was not uncommon to talk with colleagues at school about the experience of watching programs made by the class enemy. A teacher who wanted to be accepted by other teaching staff had to take part in this kind of small talk. To be sure, this kind of communication about Western television was only possible in a more narrow private circle in which there was a kind of tacit agreement, quite typically, incidentally, in a dictatorship of limits like in the GDR, where individuals had certain freedoms and a scope of maneuver as long as they remained in their immediate social surroundings, but quickly encountered limits the higher up they went. This was certainly no discussing Western programs with school directors or administrators, since the latter had an unequivocal claim to political leadership and considerable powers of sanction. And yet, the remarkable thing is that none of the teachers interviewed could recall any kind of official prohibition. Instead, they made repeated mention of a big taboo to watch Western television. This term would indicate that Western television in the GDR existed in a legal gray zone, with the exception of the service regulations for members of the armed forces, the Nationale Volksarmee, the NVA. There was no law making it a punishable offense to tune into Western programs. That private television watching habits were nonetheless a taboo topic is probably attributable to the above-mentioned campaigns from the early 1960s against using Western radio and television. The antenna storming mentioned before, after the construction of the wall, was accompanied by the demanding of written declarations renouncing the use of Western media. Voluntary agreements of this sort were expected especially of university students and served in the case of violations as a lever for possible expulsion. Several of the teachers interviewed recalled university classmates being punished to set an example after they were caught using Western media or admitted to having done so. One teacher who began his teacher training in East Berlin in the fall of 1961, the very year the Berlin Wall was erected, told the following about a fellow student, and I quote: "He had watched a soccer game with his study group. It's really quite ridiculous. In the Mitte district of Berlin, on a TV set with a tabletop antenna. As chance would have it, the picture was better on the Western channel. So they switched to the Western channel and turned off the sound, then listening to the game on the radio while following the picture on TV. And for fear of being denounced, this individual said that he simply wanted to state for the record that he was watching Western television with his study group, about 5 or 6 people, and that while he was sorry about it, he just wanted to get it out into the open so that everything would be fine." End of quote. The student was lucky and was not expelled. Too many of his classmates were involved in the affair, and the demand for new teachers was simply too great to expel them all from teachers' training college. And so the students got away with a warning and were allowed to continue their studies. Said teacher, however, had learned his lesson from the public disciplinary procedure that followed and refrained from using Western television or radio after that. This applied to entertainment shows as well. After all, the student was not criticized for watching a political information program on Western television, but for tuning into a sports event. And this just because of a better picture quality. The authorities in this instance were not only interested in upholding the SED's, the Communist Party's monopoly on information, the reception of Western entertainment shows was actually considered a threat, the dreaded ideological diversion of the imperial mass media, as was put in these terms. This belief in the direct negative influencing of the East German population through Western media had two basic causes. First, the SED clung tenaciously to Lenin's understanding of the mass media as a propaganda tool, so that the entertainment function of television was long underestimated. East German television was conceived as a journalistic medium in which even cultural content was meant to reflect socialist convictions. Entertainment was there to serve propaganda interests. The SED imputed this same intention to Western television, though granted with a different agenda. It suspected that the capitalist consciousness industry, die Bewusstseinsindustrie, was lurking behind the enemy's entertainment shows and was out to manipulate unsuspecting East Germans. The second cause for the rejection of Western entertainment programs was to be found in the generational conflict that emerged in the GDR in the 1950s. The old communist leaders, socialized in the Weimar labor movement and hence eager to spread education to the masses, as well as the functional elites of the immediate post-war generations, the so-called generation of Reconstruction, die Aufbaugeneration, which experienced tremendous upward mobility after the war. Both of them had trouble understanding the generation that followed. Although the latter were the first generation of East German citizens supposedly raised in an atmosphere free of capitalist influences and hence fulfilling the ideal of the new socialist individual, many young people had other aims in life than building socialism and generally seemed more interested in jeans and rock and roll. Hence, the younger generation had become an internal enemy, ein innerer Feind. Political and educational functionaries blamed this situation on Western entertainment and took vigorous measures to counteract it. Antenna storming, confiscation of TV and radio sets, making public examples of offenders. The consumption of Western television and radio was thus systematically politicized, even though the consumers of these programs rarely had political motivations and mostly did so for personal pleasure. The media habits of most East Germans were primarily an individual pursuit of happiness aimed at satisfying their personal needs. In this respect, the GDR was no different from other modern societies. This essentially unpolitical satisfaction of needs in the GDR took on a political character, however, in the context of the Cold War and given the existence of mass media spanning the Cold War divide. It was this that made the private consumption of Western television a form of cultural resistance and occasionally of silent protest. The thrill of doing something forbidden was sometimes just as important. The fact that Western television became a political taboo stood in stark contrast to the daily media habits of most East German citizens. As public propagandists and private consumers, the teachers interviewed found different ways of dealing with the conflict between political expectations and personal viewing behavior. By no means were they transmission belts of the SED dictatorship who implemented in a linear manner the claims to power of state and party and systematically opposed their students using Western media. In reality, they developed eigensinnig, self-willed strategies of dealing with this problem. Some teachers did in fact renounce Western television, demanding that their children and students do the same. This was probably done in the spirit of time serving more than as a matter of conviction. While there were teachers who consistently rejected Western television on ideological grounds, pragmatic considerations were usually the deciding factor. As teachers and multipliers of state power, they imagined that they were under particular scrutiny and abstained from watching Western television at home in the interest of protecting themselves, so as not to be denounced by their own children. By willingly putting on ideological blinders and only tuning into East German television, they also avoided uncomfortable truth and confrontations. For the very same reason, these teachers demanded that their students also toe the line and only use East German media. Some teachers found this was the easiest way to nip discordant voices in the bud. Other teachers ignored the television viewing habits of their students and regularly watched Western programs themselves. Remarkably, they did not feel conflicted. They simply repressed the dissonance between the authorities' demand for loyalty and their own media consuming habits. The majority of interviews confirmed this finding. Political loyalty to the East and an orientation towards Western media were by no means mutually exclusive. Many teachers felt they had earned a loyalty bonus through their considerable social commitment in other often conflict-ridden areas where accountability towards their superiors was greater. Their efforts, for example, to get as many school children as possible to take part in the Jugendweihe, the state-sponsored communist coming-of-age ceremony. It was only natural then to minimize this claim to loyalty in their own private sphere. At least at home they deserved a break and should be able to tune into whatever they wanted, Dallas, for example. This tacit arrangement extended to the viewing habits of their students. Many teachers basically condoned with what they themselves practiced. Finally, some teachers adopted a third strategy with regard to Western television by openly repudiating the claim to renounce Western television. These were no closet oppositionists, but self-assertive Communist Party members whose fundamental convictions as socialists allowed them to deem certain demands of the party as fallacious and reinterpret them with reference to the founding fathers of socialism like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. This widespread form of eigensinnig, self-willing behavior in the GDR found expression in the words of a teacher in Friedrichshain. And I quote, "At some point I told myself, it's a stupid demand, and I looked for arguments to back it up and said, for example, Karl Marx developed his theory of capitalism while living in the midst of capitalism. He experienced it as a reality and was able to think critically and develop a theory out of it and judge for himself if what he had seen was good or bad. We are constantly supposed to condemn a system that we actually know nothing about, except what they're generous enough to share with us. So I said to myself, this is nonsense, no way. I can't live in the water and still stay dry. End of quote. The teacher quoted here taught civics, Staatsbürgerkunde, and was therefore even more responsible for the political ideological education of his pupils, and hence routinely ran into trouble when his students came with conflicting information they had gleaned from Western programs. He had no choice but to watch these shows himself in order to reduce this cognitive dissonance. If he hadn't, his students would have cooked his goose, as he said, he recalled in retrospect. Paradoxically, it was the restrictive information policy of the SED, of the Communist Party, that forced him to be more open towards Western television. Like many other teachers, he felt left down by his own country's television programming, which doggedly remained silent about certain political events that Western television reported on exhaustively. And I quote him again. There were a lot of things we had no information about. I remember once, for example, when a Korean airliner was shut down, causing the death of hundreds of people. And I remember it so clearly because we asked, is it true or not? Because Western television reported on it and Eastern TV said nothing? Then we made some inquiries at the district committee of the party. Is it true? It's not true. Then day by day a little bit more of the truth came out, and in the end the story went, it was suspected of being a spy plane, that's why. Whatever the case may have been, we were totally left in the dark. And the dumbest comment was when they said, if you have a class standpoint, you'll know what to say to your students. In other words, Ernst Thälmann was a wonderful person, so none of that can be true. End of quote. Teachers were largely left to their own devices when it came to the topic of Western television. And their insecurity only increased in the last 2 decades of the GDR. This can be traced back to 3 new challenges that teachers faced with no clear instructions from the Ministry of Education on how to deal with them in the classroom. First, the party line on Western television changed in 1971 when Erich Honecker came to power. The new head of state and party leader declared in 1973 that everyone could, quote, turn on or off Western mass media as they please, especially West German radio and television, end of quote. The party leadership slowly began to accept the fact that Western television was perceived by East German citizens as an increase in their quality of living and therefore had a stabilizing effect. The school system was hardly affected, however, by this piecemeal liberalization. Teachers were not given an official all clear with regard to Western television. Completely abandoning the boogeyman of Western media would have eroded the socialist self-image that schools were supposed to communicate. The result was that for many teachers, their earlier experiences of conflict and prohibitions encountered in the 1960s remained a formative influence. Come 1989, the taboo of Western television had hardly been lifted in the GDR. Second challenge. East German television underwent a fundamental change in 1971 after a speech by Honecker at the Eighth Party Congress of the SED, when he attested to a certain tediousness of their own television programming. Two great program reforms took the entertainment needs of East German viewers into consideration, evincing clear parallels to Honecker's economic and social policy, which aimed to win the population's loyalty by offering more consumer choices. This included the Saturday night variety shows Ein Kessel Buntes, A Cauldron of Color, which now featured original performances by stars from the West. Then in 1982, alternative programming was introduced, moving all political magazine shows on East German television from primetime slots to later in the evening, giving way to entertainment shows increasingly imported from West Germany. In their attempts to attract viewers, East German program directors had learned from the enemy. Hence, television in the GDR became more and more like its counterpart in the West. Teachers who for years had fought against the pernicious effects of Western entertainment shows were suddenly deeply irritated by the conformist nature of East German television itself and had a lot of explaining to do to their students. They felt like they had been stabbed in the back by their own TV stations. Third challenge, television in West Germany also underwent a momentous change with the advent of private television stations in 1985, which as of 1987 were freely available on the airwaves in East Berlin as well. The private broadcasters Sat.1 and RTL Plus from Luxembourg initially offered mostly American series to begin with. Private television also established entirely new formats like the morning edition, an unfamiliar challenge for many of the teachers interviewed. One of the teachers from Friedrichshain recalled, and I quote, "I was astonished to find out that my students were even watching television before they came to school. I was pretty astonished. I couldn't understand why anyone would watch television before school. And it was obviously private stations they were watching. These students were usually the ones whose grades were not so good, and it was naturally hard not to comment, 'You should sleep a little longer instead of watching television.' By the late 1980s, the situation was a little more relaxed, though. It was not about politics anymore, but the fact that they were simply spending too much time in front of the television set. It was evident in the poor performance, their lack of concentration in everything." End of quote. Teachers were opposed to morning programs, not so much in their function as the propagandists of the state and guardians of the SED's monopoly on the media, but in their role as concerned educators. It was in their own professional interest that they struggled with private broadcasters for the attention of the students. By associating the American shows broadcast on private stations with the notion of trash and filth, they reactivated a deep-seated resentment characteristic of their profession, the loathing of American popular culture, thus calling to mind the post-war years in East and West when an educated middle-class elite was waging a hopeless battle against dime novels and jazz music. The fear that private television was dumbing the population down was rooted in a long tradition of German cultural criticism on the part of concerned educators. In this regard, the politicization of entertainment in the GDR needs to be viewed not merely against the backdrop of the SED's desire to structure everyday life according to its own dictatorial interests, but also as part of a cross-system engagement with modern mass culture and the entertainment-oriented mass consumption it entailed. I come to my last part, media history as urban history. In East Berlin, this cultural struggle had an added element of controversy, given that it was primarily working class youth from older East Berlin neighbourhoods whom the SED leadership considered especially susceptible to imported Western entertainment. Just like in the immediate post-war period, when juvenile delinquents such as the notorious Glado gang on Schreinerstraße in Friedrichshain were inspired by American gangster movies to carry out their own heists, popular Western media was suspected of corrupting working class youth. This was evident in the state's reaction to the massive numbers of East Germans going to Kreuzberg border cinemas prior to 1961, which after the construction of the Berlin Wall was replaced with the widespread reception of Western radio and television programs. Even though the SED's attitude towards political ideological diversion of the class enemy did relax somewhat over the decades, the enjoyment of Western television in the East remained politically charged. The fact that interest in Western entertainment shows mostly in Western entertainment shows mostly sprang from an unpolitical desire for distraction tended to get short shrift. And yet, in a broader sense, Western media did convey alternative lifestyles, different than the ones on offer in the GDR. They showed how different life was on the other side of the wall and how many ways there were to have fun. Thus, the Blattschuss brothers, die Gebrüder Blattschuss, singing their Kreuzberger Nächte sind lang, Kreuzberg Nights, on the ZDF hit parade in 1978, conjured up images of the Wild West in the midst of East Berliners. When Western pop stars like David Bowie performed on the immediate western side of the Brandenburg Gate in 1987 during celebrations to mark the 750th anniversary of Berlin, East German fans flocked to the eastern side before being dispersed by their own security forces. For the very first time, indignant and very, very disappointed fans reacted by publicly chanting "The wall must go" or singing "Kreuzberg nights are long" with ambiguous reference to the West Berlin May Day riots in 1987. Even though there was no direct link here to the fall of the wall 2 years later, these events presaged the system-defeating power of a Western entertainment culture that had served as a central connector between East and West Berlin throughout the city's division. Entertainment culture between East and West was not a one-way street, however. Countless West Berliners made pilgrimages to East Berlin in order to go to the opera or theater or to buy cheap books, records and alcohol. And yet there is no denying that this entanglement was largely asymmetric on account of the greater appeal of Western entertainment. Whereas Western movies, television series and radio shows were eagerly followed in East Berlin, the West Berlin subculture of the 1980s more or less completely ignored the East. The history of entertainment culture in East and West Berlin thus exemplifies the asymmetric histories, both parallel and entangled, of East-West German post-war history. At first glance, the entanglement of mass media between East and West Berlin may not seem all that different than between the GDR and the Federal Republic overall. Upon closer examination, however, the special situation of Berlin reveals specific historical features with regard to entertainment culture. Personal entanglements between East and West Berlin were largely replaced by media entanglement after 1961. The comparison between the visits of the Western border cinemas and the consumption of the Western TV reveals that the entangled relations shifted after the erection of the Berlin Wall and a concomitant media transformation, but the phenomenon of a cross-border entertainment culture nonetheless remained in place. This had very concrete effects on the history of East Berlin, where Western television played a special role for reasons other than optimal reception. The many pre-war buildings in East Berlin with their antennas on and under the roof, but also the working class social structure in many parts of East Berlin's inner circuit districts made Western television a political issue, one that shifted over time. However, the fear among educated middle-class elites of ideological diversion of the class enemy gradually giving way to more traditional anxieties about the dangers of urban working-class youth and their unregulated consumption of Western entertainment. Urban history and media history therefore need to be viewed in tandem as inextricably linked. In this regard, the history of entangled entertainment in East and West Berlin points to the methodological potential of an integrated German post-war history. Thank you for your attention.